The sterile hospital lights buzzed above me, but the silence on the other end of the phone was much louder. "We called both of your parents, sweetheart," the nurse said, her voice filled with hesitation. "Your dad answered, but he said they were at the airport boarding a flight to Paris and couldn't cancel." Moments later, my phone vibrated in my shaking hand. A notification appeared on social media, a new photo posted by my sister, tagged with my parents. Finally, Paris family trip. No stress, no drama. They knew I had collapsed on stage immediately after receiving my diploma. They knew an ambulance had taken me away. Yet, they stepped onto that plane without a second thought. But while they flew across the Atlantic to celebrate without me, only one person hurried through those hospital doors, completely out of breath: my grandfather. And what he carried with him in a battered leather briefcase was about to transform our family forever. My name is Grace. I'm 22 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I was the forgotten daughter. While my younger sister Maya was showered with affection, costly gifts, and endless praise for doing the bare minimum, I was expected to carry the entire world on my shoulders, without ever complaining. I worked 2 part-time jobs, paid for my own textbooks, and spent countless sleepless nights studying just to graduate at the top of my university class. I thought that maybe, just maybe, walking across that stage with honors would finally make my parents look at me with pride. On the day of my graduation, the heat inside the auditorium was unbearable. I stood in my black cap and gown, my heart pounding against my ribs, waiting for my name to be announced. I scanned the packed crowd for my parents' faces, but their seats were vacant. When I finally walked across the stage to receive my diploma, a sudden wave of dizziness struck me like a physical blow. The world began spinning. My vision faded into complete darkness, and I collapsed right in front of thousands of people. When I opened my eyes hours later, the harsh hum of hospital lights filled the room. A nurse quietly approached my bedside, her face marked with deep sympathy. "We called both of your parents, sweetheart," she said, her voice filled with hesitation. "Your dad answered, but he said they were at the airport, boarding a flight to Paris, and couldn't cancel." Before I could even understand her words, my phone vibrated in my trembling hand. A new photo notification appeared on social media. A picture of my parents and Maya smiling at the departure gate, captioned, "Finally, Paris family trip. No stress, no drama." They knew I had collapsed. They knew an ambulance had rushed me away. Yet, they stepped onto that plane without looking back. The heavy door to my hospital room swung open, and the frantic sound of rushing footsteps shattered the painful silence. I looked up, expecting another doctor, but instead I saw my grandfather, Arthur. He was breathless, his hair messy, gripping a worn vintage leather briefcase tightly against his chest. The instant his eyes met mine, the tension in his shoulders disappeared, replaced by an expression of pure, gentle relief. He didn't speak at first. He simply hurried to my bedside, placed the heavy briefcase down, and pulled me into a hug that felt warmer than anything I had known in years. "I'm here, Grace," he whispered, his voice shaking with emotion. "I'm right here, sweetheart." He had driven nearly 2 hours straight the moment he heard the news. When I told him about the phone call with my dad and showed him the social media post from the airport, a dark, silent fury crossed his face. For years, Grandpa Arthur had watched from the sidelines as my parents treated me like an afterthought, showering Maya with endless attention while leaving me to fend for myself. But watching them abandon me in an emergency room to board a flight to Paris was the final straw. He took my trembling hand in his and stared directly into my eyes. "Listen to me, Grace. You have spent your whole life breaking your back trying to earn love from people who only know how to take. No more. You are never going to beg for their validation again. I'm going to make sure of it." 2 days later, the hospital released me with strict instructions to rest. My body was completely exhausted from years of chronic overwork, severe fatigue, and a mild heart arrhythmia triggered by intense stress. Returning to my parents' empty house wasn't an option. So, Grandpa Arthur took me straight to his peaceful, rustic home on the outskirts of town. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waking up to a mountain of demands or the suffocating feeling that I had to prove my worth. Grandpa made certain I had warm meals, a quiet space, and complete peace. I decided to disappear completely from the outside world. I put my phone on Do Not Disturb mode, deliberately ignoring the endless stream of glamorous photos my parents and Maya were uploading from Paris. They were posing in front of the Eiffel Tower, eating at expensive restaurants, and living as though I didn't even exist. Every picture reminded me of where I stood in their lives, but surprisingly, the pain started to fade, replaced by an unfamiliar sense of clarity. Instead of obsessing over their absence, I focused completely on my recovery. As my strength gradually returned, I began helping Grandpa around his house. He started showing me his old personal archives, property deeds, and family ledgers that he kept stored in his study. As we spent those peaceful afternoons working together, I realized Grandpa wasn't simply helping me recover physically, he was quietly preparing me for a huge change that was about to happen. 2 weeks after my collapse, I finally decided to turn off Do Not Disturb mode on my phone. The moment my mobile signal reconnected, the device erupted into a violent storm of notifications. Screen after screen lit up with alerts, revealing 65 missed calls, dozens of desperate voicemails, and an endless stream of text messages from my father. The first messages were demanding, but the latest ones carried an unmistakable tone of sheer panic. The newest text read, "Grace, answer immediately. It's an emergency. We need you to unfreeze your college savings account right now." I sat at Grandpa's kitchen table, scrolling through the chaos of messages with a cold, distant feeling in my chest. Not one text asked how I was doing. Not one call was made to see if I had survived the emergency room. My father didn't care about my health, my graduation, or my collapse. He only cared because they had stumbled into a massive financial disaster in Europe. As it turned out, Maya had gone on an uncontrolled shopping spree through luxury boutiques across Paris, maxing out my father's credit cards. To make matters worse, she had accidentally damaged an expensive rental vehicle, leaving my parents facing thousands of dollars in immediate legal and financial penalties. Unable to cover the enormous bills, they desperately needed access to the $15,000 college fund that my late grandmother had set aside for my education, an account that required my explicit personal signature as a 22-year-old adult to release. They didn't miss me, they simply needed my money. 3 days later, the peaceful quiet of Grandpa Arthur's house was shattered by the sound of tires screeching in the driveway. My parents and Maya had ended their trip early, flying back from Paris in a state of frantic desperation. Before I could even rise from the porch, my father slammed his car door shut and stormed up the walkway, his face red with anger, followed closely by my mother and a sullen-looking Maya. "Where have you been?" my father snapped, stepping directly into my personal space without even pausing for breath. "We've been calling you for days. You ignored us while we were stranded in a foreign country dealing with a financial crisis." My mother immediately joined in, her voice dripping with fake outrage. "Grace, how could you be so selfish? Your sister is facing legal trouble over a simple misunderstanding, and you couldn't even be bothered to answer your phone to help your own family. Family comes first." I looked at them, completely unaffected by their shouting. "And where were you when I collapsed on stage? Where were you when the ambulance took me away?" My father waved his hand dismissively. "Oh, stop being dramatic. The hospital said, you just fainted from heat. You were fine, but Maya needed us, and right now we need you to sign those papers to release the trust funds immediately." Before I could respond, the front door swung open, and Grandpa Arthur stepped onto the porch carrying his vintage leather briefcase. His voice boomed like thunder. "That is enough," he said, stepping between them and me. "You will not speak to my granddaughter like that in my house ever again." Grandpa Arthur placed the heavy vintage leather briefcase onto the wooden porch table with a sharp, deliberate thud. The sudden noise sliced through my father's furious protests, bringing both of my parents to an immediate stop. My father opened his mouth to argue, but Grandpa raised one hand, silencing the entire porch with an authority that allowed no room for debate. Slowly, Grandpa released the brass locks of the briefcase and lifted the lid. He removed a stack of pristine, seal-stamped legal documents and spread them across the table. You spent 22 years treating Grace like a servant while throwing money at Maya's reckless behavior, Grandpa said, his voice calm and cold. You thought you owned everything, this family's estate, the land, the main investment portfolio, but you forgot one crucial detail. My father's forehead creased as he leaned closer to examine the paperwork. What are you talking about, Dad? 30 years ago, when your mother and I established the family trust, we included a clause, Grandpa explained, pointing directly at a highlighted section on the first document. Control of the entire estate stayed with me until my passing, with the sole right to name the primary beneficiary based on family conduct. I kept hoping you would mature and treat your daughters equally, but when you abandoned Grace in an emergency room to go to Paris, you proved you were unfit. Grandpa picked up a pen and signed the final line of the transferred deed directly in front of him. As of 10 o'clock this morning, the entire Whitaker estate, the properties, and the family funds have been legally transferred to Grace. You get nothing, not a single cent. My father turned completely pale, realizing their leverage had disappeared. The force of Grandpa's words hung in the air, leaving my parents frozen in complete disbelief. My father stared at the signed documents, his mouth hanging open, desperately searching for words that wouldn't come. Maya started crying, realizing that the endless safety net she had depended on her entire life had vanished in a single morning. For the first time,